Greetings and welcome here to today's hour-long painting. We're going to begin here with this large square-headed brush that you can see right here. I'm going to dip it in water, a good amount. I'm only getting the tip of it wet. I don't want this area to get wet, as that can kind of mess up the binding of the brush. You just want from there down. Then I'm going to wipe off a little bit of it, but the brush is still significantly damp. This is going to help me apply a lot more paint and spread it smoothly, also extending its wet life. So here I'm taking some titanium white, and I'm applying it across the base of our horizon, moving back in horizontal strokes. I'm also blending it upwards slightly. Now I'm going to get a little bit of additional water. Again, only putting the tip of my brush in there. Going to grab some additional titanium white, apply that to the bottom, begin to blend it upwards. It's very watery and thin at this point, which is good because I want it to be more thick at the bottom and more thin at the top. That's the case because I'm going to take some primary blue. I'm going to begin applying it to the top, as you can see here, and with these horizontal strokes, I'm going to begin blending downwards slightly. Just like that. The bottom isn't a pure white, but it's very close. It does have a little bit of blue in it. Grab a little bit more. Apply that to the top. I also kind of want to get the edges a little bit darker, a little bit more blue, and create a bit of a vignetting effect. So I start generally at the top, and then I'll blend down to the corner. But this middle area is still going to be pretty bright. This way the viewer's eye will go to the middle, and it will stay there for the most part. We're able to get such soft blends because I'm using a very soft application with my brush. I'm not applying much pressure at all. Now I'm cleaning the brush off well. As you can see, we're doing this now as opposed to at the end of the painting, because I want to ensure that the brush doesn't dry with paint on it and it doesn't harden, ruining our brush. It's okay if it has a little bit, but for the most part, you do want that off. Now I'm going to switch over to my old square-headed brush. This is essentially a flat-headed brush that I peel back the bristles on, and it renders these pieces that kind of go out in different directions. So when we make a dabbing motion, we render a litany of implications as opposed to a single stroke. It saves a lot of time. I'm not going to make this brush wet initially, as it will condense all of the bristles, and you won't be able to get as many markings as you would if it were dry. So now I want a bit of a pinkish purple tree in the background here. So I'll grab a good amount of red, tiny bit of blue. The blue is a much stronger pigment than the red, so if you want a purple or something akin to that, you'll need to use a lot more red than blue, generally. See? Put some more red back in there. And that's a very stark pigment. Let's get a good amount of white. That's much more what I'd like. The value matches much more so with what we already have on the canvas. I wanted something nice and bright. I'm applying all of this in this tapping motion. As you can see, we're getting a bunch of different impressions made on the canvas. And I'm slowly rotating my brush as I move through these areas. See what I mean? Rotating it. I'm not doing it on the actual application, I'm doing it as I lift my brush, I turn, and then I reapply. There we go. We want it to be brightest on the top, as that's where the most light is going to be hitting, and then it can dissipate as we move downwards. Here we can make that a little bit brighter, fill it up a little bit more. Now I want something a little bit darker, so I'll mix in a little bit of the red, or rather the purple, and I'll apply that to the bottom area, as you can see here. This area is going to be receiving a lot less light, so it should be innately much darker. You can also apply the pigment with strokes and then apply the tapping pattern afterwards. Can save a little bit of time. There we are. Use up the rest of our paint. Scrape it on. Then I'll move to my tapping motion. And that's a really nice line of trees in the background there. So I'll clean my brush. Again, we want to be very cognizant of when we do so with this brush, because now that it's wet, if I wanted to make a lot more of those markings, I would need to dry it fully. And I want to make a lot more of those markings. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to dry it well. You can see that I'm really scraping it into the paper towel here. And now I'm going to let it sit and dry for about a minute. In the meantime, we'll work on some clouds. I'm going to do so with the smaller round-headed brush, as you can see here. These are fantastic for rendering subjects with softer edges, as these have more feathered, rounded edges. It's not great for sharper aesthetics, things in the foreground, but for things like clouds, I love brushes like these. As per usual, we'll get a good amount of water. I'm only getting the bristles in, I'm not getting that metal piece, because again, I want the binding to remain on the brush. Then I'll grab a little bit of titanium white, I'll move it over here. And I want these clouds to be fairly transparent at first, so I'm going to grab some extra water, mix it in there. You see how it quickly became something that could be drippy, as opposed to a consistent paint? That's what I want. I'm going to start by creating some clouds that kind of wrap around the sky and frame our painting. Because it's so wet, it's going to be very transparent. And that works really nicely because it creates a subtle cloud. It's not too standoutish, and clouds should be semi-transparent anyway. Most of them anyway. I'm moving my brush in a circular motion for a lot of the larger applications, as it'll create something much softer. And if you find that it's too transparent, you can grab some titanium white void of water and you can reapply that into those areas until you get the right thickness that you really want. There we are. It blends in really nicely with the white that we have at the bottom. And I'm trying to ensure that my clouds, while they kind of arc in both ways, are different enough. I do still want diversity. That is a major important factor. Just like that. You also notice that I'm not doing all of the clouds at once. I'll apply some, and then I'll go back to my palette. I'll reapply, I'll look at it, I'll make an assessment, and then I'll go back in. And I do this because I like to take my time deciding what I want to do. It's okay, we have the time. We can work pragmatically. So that is what our clouds are going to look like. I'm fairly happy with that. Actually, talked about reassessing. We want to fill this one out just a little bit more. Just like that. There we are. Okay, so I'm going to clean this brush well, as you can see. Doesn't take long, it's not a big brush. Now I'm going to move back to my old square-headed brush. At this point, it's just about dried. So I can go in and work on some new pigments. And I want to work in some green trees in the back here. But we don't have green on our palette. How do we make that? We use some primary yellow, a good amount, tiny bit of primary blue. See how minuscule that is on the brush? You can barely see it. But has a big effect on the pigment. There we are. Now I'm going to want to wash it out a bit, so we'll grab some white. It is in the far distance, of course. But right there, it's too saturated for that pigment, right? If they were to go together, this would really stand out. So what I need to do is get a little bit of Mars Black. We'll undo that. Put it on our palette here. Mars Black is a very strong pigment, much more so than most paint, so we'll be using a very minuscule amount. But I'll just get it with the corner here. See? Move that in. We have a nicer olive. And now I have something that's a similar value to that, right? It's not too dark, it's not too light, it's not too saturated. Just right for the background. And I'm applying it with this tapping motion, and portions of the pink are showing through, which I really like. Just like that. They're kind of blending, not technically, but optically. We'll get a bit of a darker mixture. We'll take a little bit of the black, move it down there, take some yellow. The black and the yellow will innately make a green, so you don't have to worry about the blue. And it'll be a little bit more desaturated, which is nice. So here I'm just applying this darker color to the bottom of a lot of our foliage, because it won't be receiving the same light. There we go. Remember that tapping motion? It's really what's going to make this get the effect it needs. Now, as we move forward in the painting, generally you want things to get more saturated and you want them to have a more heightened value. So it's going to get more green, and we're also going to incorporate more stark colors, like more blacks, more dark greens. It's not going to be washed out like the background. The backgrounds are generally more desaturated and maybe even akin to the color of the sky and the reflective colors around it. So that's also worth noting. Things in the foreground have more of their innate coloring. Things in the background generally have more of a similar coloring. They kind of blend. And they also do so in the style application and all of that. Now, with that said, let's move forward. So, I'm going to take some additional black. I'm going to take some white, or rather yellow. Going to make a dark green here. Going to work my way around some rocks. Use that tapping motion once it's applied. And we can go back in and add highlights. We're just building a base right now. We'll be throwing a lot of rocks and trees in here. But now's a good time to throw in the grass. And some bushes. There we are. More black, more yellow. Isn't it amazing how strong the black is in this mixture? Because the yellow is so naturally transparent and the black is so naturally opaque, it overtakes it very easily. Now up there, there's no depth, there's no progression, right? So what we need to do, we need to take more of that bright color, interject that into the top, and then blend it downwards. So we'll remix a little bit of that. Get something nice, a little bit of blue, a little bit more yellow. If you have too much paint on your brush, start the dabbing effect here, and it should lessen it. And you can just take some of that paint. Here you can see dabbing on some highlights. And again there. So it doesn't look as stark. It gets darker as we move downwards. Here, we can add in some highlights. A couple of different places. And the contrast in the foreground is going to be very notable because we'll have very bright highlights and we'll have very dark pigments as well. It's the contrast that makes it stand out. If it were just one or the other, very dark or very light, it probably wouldn't, because it would blend with everything else. Here, I want to make this color more akin to that. So I tried adding in a lighter color, but we noticed that it's not that lighter color. So we'll troubleshoot. We'll add in a little bit of black. Yet again, don't have the color I want. But it's nice, it kind of looks like it's in the foreground now. So it's okay to change your paintings as they're kind of coming along. You don't have to stick to the same initial idea. You can adapt. There we are. That is my phone, which I need to check. I will be right back. Alright, so we left off just adding in the highlights here. And our grass, our foliage, our bushes, it isn't done because we'll need to go back and add in more highlights. We'll need to make it cohesive, and we'll need to layer on top of our trees and rocks. But it's a good foundation that will help us move into the next section. And that is the trees in the far distance. So for these, we're going to be using a smaller square-headed brush, as you can see here. It has a very fine, sharp edge, and it can hold a good amount of paint. Because of its sharp edge, it's great for rendering subjects that are a little bit more fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this brush, I'm going to take a little bit of this burnt umber, I'll move that over here, take a little bit of titanium white, thicken the pigment. Titanium white is a very thick pigment, burnt umber is a fairly thin pigment. You'll probably want to thicken it up a little bit. Then I'll take a tiny bit of Mars Black, mix that in there. As we can see, the Mars Black is very strong, but that's a nice mixture, so I'll grab a little bit of additional water so we can spread the paint nice and smoothly. And then I'll go back to the tree that I drew, and I'll begin to draw this in, just following the lines. I drew my tree with a black Sharpie, so it shows through the first couple layers of acrylic paint. And it doesn't blend or bleed, which is nice. Now we're not using a very stark brown here because it is fairly far away. We want something kind of subtle in the background. We don't want something too overtaking. If we're going to make it darker or more stark, we're going to do it at the bottom, because that's an area that's not receiving much light at all. So we'll get a little bit more black, and I'll apply that down here. If you find that you're getting a bit of a toothy aesthetic, that it isn't being applied cleanly, I'd simply implore you to incorporate more water. There we are. That's a nice mixture. You see how it's brighter at the top and then it progressively gets darker? We can also take a similar mixture, like that, and incorporate some additional trees that are a bit farther away. These are very small. I didn't draw them in because they can be a little bit more random. There we go. Nice and far in the distance. Be very careful when you're incorporating them in the real background there, because you want it to be incredibly subtle, almost unnoticeable. Just like that. They don't all have to be straight. It's probably good to incorporate bends and movements. And you want to create different clusters, but ensure that those clusters are different and always changing. Now I'm going to work on this tree while I let that one dry, because we can't apply the foliage until it's fully dry. So here, it's a bit closer, so I'm going to use almost a pure Mars Black with a little bit of blue. going to draw this in. Very easy at this point, very similar to coloring. Also worth noting, this is an issue, or rather something I do that I probably shouldn't do, and I should advise you against. I don't do it in my oil work. But when I do these paintings, because I'm painting with the camera, and I'm trying to get everything in a small frame, I hold my brush almost like a pencil a lot of the time, right? However, we're really meant to hold the brush down here, and we're supposed to paint like this. It can be a little bit difficult to get control of initially, but it ensures that you stand farther away from the canvas and you get a better perspective on what you're actually doing. So it's a really good thing to get in practice of, but because I am filming and I need to be aware of my camera space, I generally hold it much closer. But if you wanted to kind of improve the way you perceive your paintings, holding the back of the brush and standing a little bit farther away from the canvas is an easy way of doing that. Here we're using some blue tones to give it a little bit of extra depth, and it'll look really nice with the oranges that we apply later, as orange and blue are complementary colors. I'm going over some of these areas multiple times because acrylic paints are innately fairly transparent and you can see through them generally through the first application, especially if it's very wet. So I go back and I do a good number of those. Let's take a little bit of this. I had another branch here that I thought I'd incorporate, but I'm kind of worried it might overcomplicate it. So instead I'll make it a subtle tree in the background. Just like that. And you see the difference in color. This one looks so much farther away because it's a lot brighter, it's a little bit more transparent. It's not as stark. It's very desaturated. We can throw another one back here. By incorporating multiple with the same colors, we're creating a very cohesive nature amongst our pigments here. There we go. Now, this is going to be a birch tree. So I'm going to take some titanium white. I'm going to apply it like this. So I'm going to the edge, and I drag backwards. Or I do a bit of a tapping motion. I'm not dragging the brush down the tree. I'm trying to get some texture. I'm trying to create an interesting application. Just dragging back like that. Because the black is still wet, it's going to blend into a gray if you move the brush. If you kind of drag it, but if you just do a tapping, you'll get more of the pure titanium white. What I'm trying to do though is get an eclectic mix of the two. So we'll apply it and then I'll blend back a little bit. If I blend too much, then I'll apply more white. It also doesn't have to be perfect, because the skin on the bark of the birch tree very rarely ever is. It'll look a lot more interesting if you're a little bit messy. So it's a fairly cathartic thing to do. Also worth noting, we're highlighting this side of the tree because the light's coming from here. So this side's going to be darker because the light isn't in that area. And by wrapping the light around it, we create depth. I'm trying to cover up a lot of the black with a dark gray, because I don't want the tree to take away too much attention from everything else. It needs to be balanced. That's something that's a very important lesson. Just because you can make something much more detailed and much more highly contrasted doesn't mean you should. Sometimes you need to make things significantly more subtle. That way, they blend with everything else, and it's balanced correctly. Now, because I've applied all of this water and paint so quickly, because I did the black, the white, the gray consecutively, it's all very muddy right now. It's difficult to add in a pure white and have it be a pure white, because it's also wet, because it's all blending. So I need to let that dry before I come back to it. In the meantime, this tree right here has dried, so I can go back to that. So we're going to grab a bit of our yellow, a little bit of our blue, grab a little bit of black, just a very small amount, maybe a little bit more. And I'm going to begin with the small square-headed brush, applying some foliage. Now, because of all of the water on my brush, it's very transparent, it's very bright. It's not the color we have on our palette, which is important to remember, that the color on your palette may not be the color on your painting, because it's going to blend with what's on your painting and with the water. So here we're making an even darker mixture to kind of combat that. And we're using such a dark pigment because I'm going to build lighter pigments on top of it. I just need a base. There we are. That looks good. I'm doing a bit of a tapping motion with a little bit of a drag here and there. I'm trying to do it sporadically. I'm leaving openings in the tree. And I'm also creating clusters here and there. See that? We'll connect a couple of branches, make the base a little bit more full. We can incorporate this color back here a little bit, and here, just to make it cohesive. This way it looks like there are a couple of these trees. Now the trees themselves aren't that aesthetically pleasing yet, or interesting, but they're not meant to be because they're in the background. They're meant to accent things, to add to it, not to be it. And that's important. So much like this tree, we didn't want it to stand out too much. We don't want these ones. Now I'm going to take a highlighted version, so we'll take some of our yellow, take a little bit of our titanium white, a little bit of our blue, get something a bit brighter. It's not hyper saturated, as you can see, which is good. And we'll just add on some highlights to the edges. On this tree, the highlight was on the right hand side because of where the light is. On this tree, the highlight's going to be on the left hand side because of where it is in relation to the light. And I'm just tapping this on areas I think that will be receiving the most light. So generally the top area and the left hand side, but not all of the top or left hand side. I'm being sporadic with it. Just like that. And there, we have a fairly decent background tree. That, however, is too dark. So, we can cover that up very easily. That's something also that's very important. Don't be afraid to try things when acrylic painting. It's all very easy to fix. You just need to let it dry and apply a layer or two. It's better to be exploratory. Now, while we worked on that tree dried. So, I can take more titanium white and go back and fix that up now. Because I won't have the very muddy aesthetic that I did before. It'll now receive a pure titanium white that won't blend to such an extent that it did before. Being very delicate, I'm not applying much pressure with my brush. When you apply a lot of pressure with your brush, generally the bristles expand and you don't get a clean line, which is why we're doing a very soft tapping for most of this. Just like that. Now, in the meantime, it's also worth noting that our clouds are almost unnoticeable now. Did you realize that? That's because acrylic paints do dry so much more desaturate, or rather transparently. That's the word I'm looking for. So we start to lose them. Sometimes we need to go back and re-add in those colors. So here I'm using that smaller round-headed brush, and I'm not using water this time. So I'll get a much more rough edge, but I'm being soft, as you can see, trying to get a bit of a feathered effect. But by not using water, we get something that's much less transparent. And it'll dry much less transparent. So it's about finding the right balance between the two. You make a sacrifice either way, but you make the right sacrifice. That's what it's about. Or you can do a combination of the two like I did. And I think the multiple layers, the accumulation works well. It can be really difficult to paint these around trees, but sometimes it's necessary and it's okay to do that. Just know that it's generally easier to start in the background of a painting and work your way forwards. That way you don't have to work around subjects, you can work on top of them. But again, we can break these rules. We can do this. I'm not dipping my brush in water here as well because it's green at this point, and we're working with titanium white, so we'd actually get a bit of a green color up here in the clouds, which is really not what we want. This one really stands out because it's against a lot of the darker clouds. Not a bad thing, but good to remember. If you really want your clouds to stand out, paint a bit of a darker blue sky. If you want them to be subtle, use more of a light blue sky. Now that I'm done with the brush, I can wash it in the green water. Clean it off, just like so. Now I'm going to switch over to that square-headed brush that I was using. Ensure that it is damp. Grab some burnt umber, some Mars black, a little bit of titanium white to thicken everything. And I'm going to work on my next tree. This is more in the middle ground. As you can see, I'm getting a little bit of a rough texture right there, telling me I need more water. So I'll grab that, grab a little bit more paint. Now I know this is difficult for you to see, but I'm using my pinky finger to ground my hand on the canvas on a dry part, which helps me keep steady when I make these applications. And again, don't press hard with your brush or it will expand and you won't get the fine, cleaner lines you want. If you don't have paint on your brush, grab more paint. Don't try to drag out what's on your canvas. Here we used a lot of water to get a very sharp edge, but as you can see, made the paint incredibly transparent, and we can see all of the foliage through what I'm doing right now, which, honestly, is not hyper ideal. It's also worth noting that when it's very watery, you can just scrape it off like that. You can do so many things here. So, grab some pigment. Here I have a really nice consistency. Got a little bit lucky, admittedly. And I'm able to use a good amount of paint with a good amount of water, get my sharp edges, and the paint is very opaque. That's really the goal here. Now I said we'd have to redo the bushes, and this is why. When we come down here, we're creating a sharp edge, and the bush shouldn't have a sharp edge if it's overlapping the tree. So, this is why we mentioned that earlier, and that's okay. There we go. It's a nice thick tree. Cleaning my brush off, as we've done 100 times before. It's an important part of the process. And now we want to add some highlights to the edge of the tree. Now, if we wait for the tree to dry, these highlights are going to be the exact color that we mix on our palette. Or if we apply it right now while the paint's wet, it'll be a combination of what we have on our palette and on there. I kind of want to do a combination because I want it to be a subtle highlight. Because this is in the far distance, or rather the midground, it isn't close up. So we're not going to see the heavy contrast from the dark and the light. We're going to see more of a combination, much like in that tree. So I'm not looking for a very stark contrast, but I'm looking for a bit of one. So here I have some burnt umber, some titanium white, and that's a very bright color in comparison to that, right? But when I apply it on here, it won't be. Not to such an extent. I'm applying this in the same way that I did the birch tree bark. I'm doing a bit of a tap, and then a little bit of a drag. I'm not going from the top of the tree downwards, or the bottom of the tree upwards. I'm doing it with this textured application. It'll look like little pieces of bark getting some light. Look much more textured and interesting. Here you can see it's really blending. We'll need to get some more paint. Because of all of the water, we're getting something almost transparent. There we are. That stands out. Not too much, but just enough. It's good to take your time with this. Ensure that you're actually getting the highlight on the edge and you don't have a dark piece on the other side of the highlight. That can look a little bit sloppy. Don't want that. And I'm slowly building up the highlights. As the first layer dries, we create a bit of a brighter base. So now when we apply these highlights, when we see through them a little bit, because they're acrylic and wet, we'll see the highlighted base instead of the dark base. So it'll be a little bit brighter. There we are. I know that my hand's getting in the way of portions of this, but if you want me to do the best job I can, it's a little bit necessary here and there. But I am trying to remain cognizant of keeping it out of the way as much as possible. I'm not adding these super highlights everywhere. I'm just picking a couple areas and getting the tree to a place that I like. Now, before we continue with this painting, we need to let this tree dry entirely. So we're going to take a break for about 5 minutes, and then we'll come right back. Now I've fully let that tree dry, and in the meantime I cleaned my water and my brushes. I also added a little bit of a yellow back to my palette because this one has some black in it, and I wanted to ensure that I was working with a very clean yellow for this next step. So what I'm actually going to do here, I'm going to take a palette knife. You could take an additional brush, I just don't want to use my old square-headed brush. I'm going to take some yellow, put it down there, clean off my palette knife, going to get some red, mix the two together. Goal is to create a nice orange, a thick orange. I'm also going to grab a little bit of burnt umber. This is going to darken it just a little bit, and it'll help make it a little bit thicker because the burnt umber is a thicker pigment than the yellow. And there, I have a nice October warm earthy orange. I'm going to take my old square-headed brush, I'm going to take a lot of this pigment, and I'm going to begin working it around this tree. As you can see, it doesn't look orange on the canvas, does it? But it looks orange right there. And that's because we can see through it, and we can see blues through it. So we need to apply it fairly thickly. I'm working around some of these branches, but we can redraw them should we need to. We'll go in and we'll do more layers, we'll do more highlights, and we'll build up the orange. But it's nice to get this darker, earthy layer in first. You'll also notice that I'm leaving openings, lots of different areas. That is important. You can put a little bit between the tree. We can even interject a little bit of orange into the background here. Make it a little bit more eclectic. This is a fall painting after all. Don't forget to cover up some of the branches. These leaves aren't just behind the tree, they're also in front of it as well. It's important that we work with both. Kind of have it falling that way. Kind of works in the same leading line as the clouds. So if the eye gets up here, it follows the foliage back down, or into the clouds, which redirect it yet again. There we are. Now, it's worth noting that this needs to dry fully before we even think about adding in any form of highlight to it. So, we need to take a break. In that break, I'm going to clean my brush, as you can see. Nice and well. We'll dry it off. Now, I'm going to switch over to this medium-sized square-headed brush. Dip it in water. Just the tip, remember, we're not going back to the metal area. I'm going to grab some burnt umber, some Mars black, and I'll draw in this tree. As you can see, because of all of the water, it's very transparent here, but it's allowing us to get very sharp edges. So we'll need to go over this a couple times, but we'll get a nice clean sharp tree. And that's really important here in the foreground. This tree can be very dark because it can have a heavy contrast. Because it is in the foreground, it's not receiving all of the reflective color. We see more of its innate coloring. We'll also work on some of the branches that protrude as well. This one will be in front of the birch tree, so don't forget to move it on top. The branches should be larger, closer to the body. And no two branches should ever really be the same. This branch can actually go behind the birch tree. Gives it this extra level of depth. kind of interesting. There we are. Doesn't have to be too complicated because we already have a good amount of things going on around here. But we can throw in a couple more branches. One there. Do that one that extends. It can come back up this way. It's interesting. And if you don't like any of these branches, don't worry about it. You can cover them with foliage. If you find that your medium-sized square-headed brush is also too large to do this sort of thing, you can switch over to the smaller square-headed brush. Now, we're at the point where all of this still needs to dry, all of this still needs to dry. So what we're going to do is we're going to move into the water of the painting. And we're just going to do the base layer of it as well. Right now that's what we're doing, base layer, base layer, base layer. We'll go in and widen the real highlights in a little bit. But right now, we'll get some water on our brush. We'll get a good amount of this primary blue, move it over here. Get some Mars black. Get a little bit of titanium white. We're making a darker desaturated blue. And I'll begin to work that in here. Predominantly working in horizontal strokes. And I'm working on the layers of water that are going to be on top. There are going to be portions of water that are falling, and I'm skipping those right now. There we go. And I'm covering portions of the trees or rather rocks and ground, because we can see through it and we can come back to it. Going to clean that up. Get a little bit of more Mars black. Throw that on the palette. And mix a bit of a thicker, less watery blue. It's all about trial and error. We still have a good amount of wet pigment here, so we're not getting a fully opaque application, but we are thickening it a little bit, and this is good practice. Hand has to be in the way through a little bit of this. I do apologize. There we are. Getting a nice base built. Clean that off well. Switch over to my medium-sized square-headed brush. Going to get a much darker mixture of what we were just using. Going to fill in the areas with falling water now. And remember, this is just the base. We haven't incorporated any water technique. We're just building up a foundation. So when we do all of the detail work and the strokes for the running water, we'll have something nice to work on top of, and we won't have to redo it 100 times because we'll already have the right base colors worked in. This is a point in the painting where everything looks very messy, very unfinished. And that's because it is all very messy and very unfinished at this point. But it's the place we need to be at. So don't get discouraged in your painting process if you find that things aren't looking exactly the way you want, because generally they're probably not supposed to yet. Right now, I was looking at the orange that I interjected there in the back, and I thought it was a little bit too saturated. So I want to turn that down a little bit and grab some red, some blue, good amount of white. We have a color similar to what we had before. I can just dab that on over some of the orange. Color is a little bit different, which is good because it'll make it a little more interesting, but it's definitely doing the job of toning down the orange that we wanted. So that now has a little bit of warmth in it from the orange, but it isn't overtaking it. And it's another example that you shouldn't worry about trying things when you're working on your acrylic painting, because you can fix them fairly simply. Now I do want to go back up to here, so I'm going to grab my palette knife, just because it'll make things cleaner. Begin mixing up another orange, and here you can see the orange without any burnt umber against the orange with burnt umber. It's a big difference. Use a little bit less burnt umber this time. Yet again, we have a nice fall pigment. So, I'm going to grab it with the old square-headed brush. Begin reapplying. This time we'll get a lot more of the natural coloring, because we already have the base, and when we see through this coloring, we see the orangey brown and not a blue or a green. But it's all about patience. We needed to apply the unaesthetic layer before we got here. And this is still the dark underlayer. It doesn't have a mid-tone or a highlight yet. So it'll get a lot better looking in time. Again, trust and patience. Vital when painting. There we go. Going to wash my brush. And because the top of the tree will be receiving a little bit more light, I'm actually going to grab a little bit of Mars Black, a little bit of burnt umber. I'm going to work that into the bottom area. Kind of blend it up a little bit. But just in that bottom back area. Nowhere else. There we go. Worked out quite nicely. Now, yet again, we need to wait for that to dry and that to dry. So we'll go back to this tree because it needs another layer. So here I have my medium-sized square-headed brush, some burnt umber, some Mars Black, and we'll just reapply. At this point we're just coloring in. Very simple. We don't have to create any new lines, we don't have to draw anything, there isn't a specific texture, we're just building up a base layer and coloring in. Don't forget to go back and do the branches as well. There we are. It's interesting when you have the branches kind of reach around the tree in different ways. Can create a very different movement. If you want your branches to look very small, just tap on a little bit of paint. It'll have small openings in the application, so it'll look like it's kind of being taken by the light, which is nice. There we go. Very subtle. Clean that up yet again. And now I'm going to move back into my water. So I'm going to grab some primary blue, some Mars black, some titanium white. You see the colors are similar. And now we have a thick pigment. We have a nice full layer. You can't see the canvas through it anymore. And it's much more of the natural coloring, because we have the base layer and the base layer is dry. We'll be adding a lot of highlights to this color in time. Now in the foreground, I'm going to use much more primary blue without the mixture of the black and the white, because I want it to be a little bit more saturated and vibrant. Just like that. We do need to go over the darker areas again though. So we'll get some Mars black, mix that in with what we just had, and fix that area up. This again is where the water is going to be falling. We can redo the rocks very simply. I'm also going to take a bit of a highlighted blue, some titanium white, some primary blue. I'm going to throw that on the edges that are close to the black and bend or blend it backwards a little bit. Don't want too much, just enough. Doesn't have to be a perfectly straight line either. And you can blend it like this, leaving little openings. It'll just make it look like the water's moving around. Won't look messy. There we are. This is where the water is going to be falling. Already starting to come together. Yet again though, we are at a place where we need to let our painting dry. So what we're going to do, we're going to clean our brushes, we're going to clean our water, we're going to reconvene in what in my time is 5 minutes. In your time, it'll be about 3 seconds. Now that we've let that dry, I'm going to move back into that tree, this time with a mid-tone. So I'm going to grab yellow, as we have before. I'm going to grab some red. I'm not using any burnt umber in this mixture. I want it to be much more vibrant. As you can see here, that is exactly what we are achieving. So we're just going to build it up slowly. That is our orange. We will apply it with the same brush we used before. So just grab a little bit of it. And we'll begin to apply it to the edges that we think will be receiving light. So predominantly the ones that are facing this side. It's important to remember that we're not going to get the actual coloring that we have on the palette for the most part. It's going to be a combination of that and what we have currently on the painting. Which is good because it gives us more room to build up. It's kind of innately giving us lots of layering. So for those of us who like to do 1 or 2 layers, this ensures that we get a lot more in and we build significantly more depth through the process. We can even throw a little bit of it down here, or even over here. Make it a little bit more interesting. Maybe back there. Now I'm going to take some titanium white, make it a little bit thicker, more thick. Make it a little bit more yellow. And you can see we go from a dark to a medium to a light. So this should really stand out comparatively. We're being very cautious with where we're applying it. Predominantly edges, areas that will have lots of light. There we are. Building up a nice subtle orange. I want the real orange tree to be this one. So this one's kind of accenting it. It's not the full, blown out, bright orange that we think of when we think of fall. It's much more in the middle. We can throw some orange in there in the middle. And just build up our layers. Very nice. Now, speaking of this tree, let's begin working some orange into it. So I'm going to begin this time with that regular orange, not the burnt umber orange. I want this, when it's done, to be much more vibrant and orange than that tree. This means that we'll probably have to layer on a good amount of paint, make it nice and thick. Yet again, it'll lead into the painting in the same way that one does. So, this time I'm not going to use a palette knife, just to show you that you don't need one. Mix up some orange. Giving it a bit of a red base can also be a good way of doing this, because the red's very saturated. And then you can build the lighter colors on top of it fairly easily. There we are. So get some more red. Much more of a thick pigment than the yellow. And when we layer the yellow over the blue, you get a little bit of a green, because the two do naturally mix to make a green. So here in this tree, using much more red as our base than the yellow. Avoid a little bit more of that green. We'll finally start to get something that looks a little bit more like a fall painting. Now it's worth noting that I didn't really cover up much of the tree here in this initial application, because we still need to add the highlights to the tree. So that's where I'm going to leave that for now, with the exception of a little bit of a highlight on these. There we go. I'm going to clean that off well. Switch over to my smaller square-headed brush. Ensure that it is damp. Grab some good burnt umber, some titanium white. It's not a bright burnt umber, but it's a lot brighter than that. So it'll make a great mid-tone. Doing this all in that tapping motion. Phone is still quite busy today. My apologies for that noise in the background. We will finish this first though. So I'm still using this tapping. And a lot of this light is going to be hitting this side, right? Because it's closest to it. However, we'll get a little bit of reflected light on the other side, but it'll be significantly less than this. So here I'm actually going to drag my brush. Give it a little bit of a reflected light on the other side. Or maybe it's wrapping around the other side. It could be either or. But it's significantly more subtle and it isn't as textured. Now, I'm going to go back, grab some titanium white, some burnt umber, just like that, and begin to build up the highlights even more. You can do it specifically on the initial impressions you made, or you can forge new ones. Remember, you want to be fairly delicate and careful. Make sure you're actually getting the edge here. You can see part of the darker portion showing through. That is not what I want. The edge should be the brightest. There we are. It's working out well, isn't it? Don't forget to do this on the smaller branches. And we can cover up some of these with foliage, should we not like them. Busy day. For the record, a lot of those noises you hear are people messaging me about these paintings, how to critique and work on them, different questions, doing a Q&A fairly soon. And I think that's what a lot of them are. So you can get excited for that. But that is a nice textured tree. You notice how as we get more so in the foreground, they get more textured. That one has a little bit. This one has a lot. We're also going to do one right here. So we'll switch over to our medium-sized square-headed brush. Get some of that burnt umber, some Mars black. And let's draw this in. This one's going to be a bit bigger because it's closer in the foreground. And while trees don't get bigger in the foreground, our perception of them does, because when things are farther in the background, they look smaller. So, if you want to create some extra additional depth, make your trees in the foreground look much more thick than the ones in the middle ground and the background. There we are. You can split into two up there. Just add to the depth of the painting. When we have a lot of water on our brush, remember we can work in some additional tree pieces because they'll be very transparent. This is just a tree in the background. Doesn't need to be as sharp. Just making things a little bit more interesting. Do another one right there, maybe another one right there. Subtle little additions. Now, as you can see here, that looks very reflective, it looks very bright, but that's because of the reflection. It's not because we used a bright pigment. So it's good to know that acrylic paints can be a little bit deceiving in these scenarios. It's not actually bright though. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to test to see if this is dry. The answer is no. So I can't work on that yet. I can't add the texture to that yet. What I can do, I can work on the water, or I can work on the rocks. I think I'm going to work on the rocks next. So I'm going to start here with that same medium-sized square-headed brush. I'm going to grab some Mars black. We'll do this down here. I'm going to grab some titanium white. We'll grab a little bit of a yellow, a little bit of a burnt umber. That's a nice color for a rock in the distance. It's a very subtle value. Remember, things in the background aren't stark, they aren't heavily saturated. So you need things that are much more muted. We incorporated the yellow, the burnt umber, because I still want it to have that earthy kind of tone to it. That might be a little bit darker, actually. So we'll grab a little bit of black, work that down at the bottom. As we get closer in the painting, we'll interject a little bit more color, a little more vibrancy. Now, while we're gauging how bright we want these to be, I generally like to layer my lighter layers over darker layers. So I don't really want to start all of these layers with these lighter pigments. I just wanted to show you what that would look like, how we were planning on approaching this, making it more saturated, more bright, more vibrant, all of that. But what I'm actually going to do, I'm just going to take some of our black, and I'm going to cover all of our rocks, even the ones in the background. And then later, I'll go back in, and I'll brighten them, and I'll desaturate them, and I'll do everything they need to make them look acclimatized to their area of depth. But this is just a much easier way of starting, blocking everything in. There we go. Might have to do a couple of layers, especially if you added a little bit of that lighter pigment like I did initially. I'm lining the majority of these edges with these rocks, just because I like the aesthetic of rock in water as opposed to grass or foliage in water. And we'll have to go back in and add our bushes on top of these as well as the trees, because we don't want our bushes to have all of these sharp edges. This whole area will be fairly dark. We can take the time to add in another little layer here. There we go. I know my hand's in the way. Necessary precaution in that scenario. We're using the brush we are right now because it does innately have those very sharp edges, which are fantastic for rendering subjects with sharp edges, such as rocks. There's one. There's another little one right here. I'll be fairly careful. As you can see, it's very watered down, very transparent. So we'll need more actual pigment to thicken that. And there we go. It's more so of what we want. We can do that here as well. And then I have a couple bigger rocks right here. Trying to make sure that all of my rocks are different. They're interesting. They're complex enough. They don't all have flat bottoms either. They can protrude in different areas, so that'll make them interesting. And we'll have water running over these ones here in the foreground, which will be nice. Let's switch to the smaller square-headed brush. Grab some more black, and just work some smaller ones in there as well. Remember, we'll be going back and desaturating a lot of these. Just building up our layers right now. Foundations, much like we did with that tree, and most everything else. Also, we have two rocks here in the foreground. Generally, when working with subjects, better to work with 3s, 5s, 7s, odd numbers. It just keeps the eye more engaged subconsciously. So we'll add in another little rock there. Clean that off. I can't add the highlights to any of these until they've dried. So we're going to need to take a break from that, and we'll go up to here yet again in the meantime. So I have my old square-headed brush. I have some red, some yellow, make a nice vibrant orange there. Begin applying that to the edges, just like so. Starting to stand out. Much more saturated than over there, as you can see. Just like we wanted. Grab some extra titanium white. Now it's much more thick. We can really see it. It's a beautiful fall tree. Just like that. If you want really heavy highlights, you can exclude the red entirely. Remember to rotate your brush. We can only add the yellow here, by the way, because we have such a thick base of the red and the orange. Otherwise, we would still be getting a green with the blue. Now, I like what we have there, but I'd like a lot more orange, actually. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some red, tiny bit of yellow, just create another base right there. As you can see, because we have such a dark tree behind, it's very transparent. So we'll need to use a good amount of paint, and then we'll have to come back later and build up the application. But that's essentially how this tree started, and now it looks like that. So, it's worth the time, worth the effort. Cleaning that off well. While I wait for that to dry, I'm going to move over to this tree, add in the highlights. So I'm using the small square-headed brush, some burnt umber, some titanium white, and yet again, we just make that same little dabbing motion. It's going to look very rough, as it should. And then we can kind of work some of them inwards as well. Going to grab some additional burnt umber just for the saturation. Get more of that coloring. There we are. If you want some of the pieces to be a little bit bigger, apply more pressure with your brush, as it will expand the bristles. Don't want to go too far in though. Wash that up nice and well. We can create a mixture, what we had with a little bit of Mars Black, to give us a nice mid-tone. Just trying to create as many variations as possible here, as it descends into the darker edge. Now we can probably go back and rework on the rocks. So I'm going to keep this brush. I'm going to take some titanium white, a little bit of red, a little bit of yellow, orange. It's a nice highlight color. Sticking to the edges, being nice and sharp. Going to create some ledges on our rocks. There we are. Some little inner pieces that'll be catching light. That's interesting. We can be a little bit more impressionistic in the background. just like that. Grab some more, but this time we'll brighten it up and get a little bit more orange. Starting on the edges, then I blend our way in. Predominantly with sharp applications, as this is made up of an amalgamation of varying geometric shapes, right? There we go. We can go in and add additional layers, and we should, to build up those highlights further. So here I'll do that right now. There we are. Remember, the bottoms don't receive as much light, so they'll be darker. And we'll want the real highlight on the top. If you find you're not achieving that, it might take a couple of layers because the pigment might be a little bit too transparent. But don't get discouraged. This black is still wet, so as you can see, it's completely overtaking the highlight. We can't work on that rock right now. Here, I'm looking at the blacks, and they're kind of thin. It's not the base I need. So I'm going to take my square-headed brush, going to reincorporate those nice bases that we had. Just ensure they're nice and thick. Because if we add on the highlight and then we decide that the black is too thin or the darker pigment, then we have to work reductively. It can be a little bit difficult. Easier to do it this way. We can also adjust this rock should we want to. Maybe I'll connect it to this one. That might look nice. See? We can also have water running on top of it or splashing up it. Make it a little bit more interesting. I'm going to switch back to this brush. Get some more red. Get some more yellow. Rebuild up this area. Maybe a little bit of black to darken it. Still very saturated. There we are. We'll need to do about 2 to 3 more layers right there to get it to look like everything else, but it is well on its way. Now I do want to finish the rocks before we continue, so I'm going to take another break, clean my brushes and my water. I know it seems like we're taking a lot of breaks in this painting, but we don't normally, and I think that it's a good thing to get in a habit of and understanding that you can put the brush down and you can sit with the painting for 10 minutes, see how you like it, see the things you want to change. It's a very healthy way of going about it, and it readjusts your perspective. Because when you sit at a painting for more than an hour or so, things can kind of become subconsciously distorted in your head, and removing yourself and coming back allows you to see things a lot more naturally. So, we're going to take another little break, and we'll be right back. So, we've let that dry. I'm going to take the old square-headed brush, going to take some red, good amount of yellow, make a nice bright vibrant orange, tap some on there, get some titanium white, build up those highlights. Now these highlights are a little bit more subdued than those. This is a orange with white, not a yellow with white. And I'm doing that because these areas won't have as much light as the top areas. These are a little bit more subdued. So, the orange is a little bit more subdued than the yellow. It's all about finding the balance. The bottoms of the trees generally a little bit darker, the tops generally a little bit brighter, the outer areas of the foliage generally a little bit brighter as well. It's important to blend the two a little bit though. Here we'll grab some yellow, grab some white, thicken it up, reapply, and we'll even move down the tree a little bit. Not too much here, but just enough for it to remain part of the same entity and tree. There we are. Also going to throw some of this down here. Some fallen leaves maybe. Just nice to have the color in more than one spot. It's a really nice color. Give it a little bit of a highlight too. There we are. Now, something that can happen through this process of creating these trees is we can get something that's a little bit too full of foliage. So, I'm going to take my smaller square-headed brush, going to get some burnt umber, mix it with some Mars black. I'm going to reincorporate some branches here, some openings in the tree that we lost. This will just make it a little more interesting. I also want pieces of branch to protrude through our tree, like that. See? So it presumably gets lost underneath and then comes out. This gives it a lot more depth. You need the combination of the two. Do this over here too. But not to such a great extent because this is in the background more and we don't want it to compete on such a heavy level, interest-wise. That's nice. Throw another little tree in there. To the back. Another one. Starting to look like a nice full painting. We'll stick with this brush. Going to grab some red. Going to grab some yellow. A little bit of burnt umber. Some titanium white. Then reapply to these. It's good that we're mixing those warm tones that we used up here, down here, because it makes it look so much more cohesive. Seems I need more white. When you have a messy palette, and you have option to grab the color, but it might have another color that you don't want, like the blue that you just saw in the white, then I'd advise getting new pigment. Because you don't want to risk ruining what you worked on because we were too lazy to get a new pigment. So there. Starting on the edge, starting sharp. Blend back. Just like that. You can have this be a little bit more grainy if you want, because it is rock, and rock does have a bit of a sharper, harder texture, just like that. Still leaving a lot of black there because I want the heavy contrast. Here I'm just using a bit of burnt umber and titanium white, not using the oranges that we mixed earlier. We can interject that if we want to. I just want to show you the different aesthetics we can get by mixing different sets of pigments, both complicated and a little bit more simple here. Let's go back up to this rock. There we are. Maybe for the next lesson, I might turn my phone off. What do you think? Is that a good idea? Is it a little bit distracting? Maybe the fact that I just keep mentioning it's distracting. Maybe it's not even caught in the camera, and this could have all been avoided. Maybe. There we are. Going to soften the edges here a little bit. Use some water for a bit of a blend. Again, I told you we can make it a little bit more gritty, or we can make it a little bit more soft. 100 ways to do just about everything when we paint. What's important is that you find the way you like to. The application styles, the aesthetics, the subjects. As long as you're happy, you're making something you like, all is well. There we go. You can even use your finger to blend a little bit. Now we're going to work on that one. I'm going to use a little bit of orange, a little bit of brown, mix it in with the white. This isn't a very bright color, but it's a good mid-tone, so we can apply this now and then add in the highlight after. Now this rock is sitting on the edge of this falling water, which means that there's a shadow going to be cast from about here to here. So it's going to get darker as we move towards the bottom. That's important to remember. So maybe we won't incorporate any highlight at the bottom. Maybe it'll be just this mid-tone. Trying to create complexities and little layering pieces within the rock. Make it a lot more interesting. There we go. Maybe throw a little bit of this color into these rocks. And now we need the real highlight. So we'll grab the titanium white, mix that up with what we were just using, go back up to the top, reapply, and blend. I'm not covering all of what we just did, just the areas that are really going to be receiving light. And that isn't too much because, again, shadows are going to be cast here. There we go. Nice and subtle, not too much. Now I'm going to begin working on my water, but that requires a clean blue color. So I need to clean my water here, otherwise if we mixed the blue with this type of water, we might get something a little bit more green, and that isn't what I want. So, taking another little break, cleaning our brushes, cleaning our water, and we'll be right back to work on our water. Now we are going to take our smaller square-headed brush, ensure that it is damp, I'm going to grab some titanium white, a little bit primary blue, make a nice bright mixture. I'm now going to apply this to the edge of the water and blend backwards in Z shapes. Just like that. It's going to be very subtle at first because we have a lot of water and we have the darker layer, but the more we do, the more it'll build up. So we'll do it again now. And as you can see, we already have a much more notable highlight, moving back in Z-shaped patterns. As it dries, it may become more transparent. You want to apply a very small amount of pressure, and we'll work it around our rocks as well. Just like this. There, you can hear the interjection of my cat. He vehemently agrees with the process, which is nice. Here, we'll do a bit of a tapping on the edge. This will be the water falling in different areas. You can do that a little bit up here, but it should be more subtle because it's farther away. And again, more Z-like patterns. Continuously putting our brush back in the water, as you can see. Dabbing around the edge. And then Z. Takes a lot of concentration, which is why I'm being a little bit more quiet. There we are. Now, how do we know when we have enough? I like to apply some, now take a little bit of a break. I'll look at it, say, okay, you know what, we could use a little bit more right here. Apply it, take a little bit of a break. Reassess, say, okay, you know what, it needs to be around that rock, it needs to be around this rock. Take a break. And I'm doing this, going back and forth, because it just ensures that I'm not over or underdoing anything. You also notice that we get more progressively white as we move closer to us. Here, grab some of that, some of that. Create some waves, Z-like pattern back and forth. We'll drag it down, keeping the top portion sharp. There we are. So we're creating these little triangular-like shapes. Up, down, dragging the bottom, blending. Not too much room for waves, but nice that we have them. Get some additional titanium white, real titanium white. Apply it to the tops, have them capping a little bit. It's an extra detail we can add. Look really nice. As water gets closer to the top, it becomes more transparent, more light can pass through it, and you get more of that natural white. There we are. Now we need to ensure that the water is also falling. We'll probably have to go back and re-add in highlights here as it dries, as it will dry a little bit more dark, a little bit more transparently, but in the meantime, we're going to switch over to the smaller round-headed brush. I'm going to grab some of that white, Mix it in with a little bit of our blue. I'm going to pick some areas, have it begin to fall. I'm doing a lot of it as a tapping motion at the top, and then I'll bring different portions down in different amounts, just like that. In areas that naturally kind of dip, I tend to pick them initially. I'll do this a lot. The white's really standing out because of the dark color underneath. We'll leave a couple little opening areas, allowing a good portion of it to be fairly transparent. And this is one way to do it, but it's not the only way. You can also use the square-headed brush. Make sure it's wet. Using the head of it, you can apply to the top and then drag down. This will give you a much more tidy aesthetic, which you might prefer. Paper towel starting to come off. I'm going to get another one and I'll be right back. So here I'm going back with that same small square-headed brush, grabbing some additional titanium white, some of our blue, going to the top and dragging downwards. I'm not going to the bottom fully. I want that still to be a little bit darker, as it won't get as much light. But you can actually intertwine these two effects if you want to. What's nice about this painting is you have a couple areas where you're going to need to do it, so you can kind of try different things and see what you like. If it is too much water, you might have an issue that you can drag it down too far. If that is the case, wipe a little bit off. You can apply it like this, and then come back to it right before it dries. Just like this. You can also use the smaller end of it to make little strokes. So many options. Then, through the process, you'll probably lose the edging, so it's good to go back and reincorporate that. Doesn't take much time at all. Water can also be running down our rocks. It's a nice little added effect. Make it run down in different ways. You can even drag some of it down. And as you slowly build it up, you get something that looks more and more like proper falling water. But it does take a couple of layers. Just like everything else, we need to build up our foundations. And because we are working with a lot of water in our water, it can take more layers than we'd innately think it would. But as you can see, we're definitely getting there. Continuously going back, building up our highlights. There we are. These ones are fun because we're working around a lot of rocks. Do a little bit more detail with them. So I'm switching my brush over to the long edge for a lot of this. There we go. Perfect. I'm really starting to like the way this is looking. But only because we were persistent. At the start, it's kind of terrible. And that's okay, because that's what it was meant to be. You can wash out the background a little bit if you'd like. Just like that if it was too dark, a little bit too stark for that area. I'm going to keep this area a little bit darker because there's so much shadow from everything around it. But we'll make this area a lot lighter. So it shouldn't be consistently the same throughout all of it. It should be changing depending upon the scenario it's in. When we add in all of this white, we'll need to rework on our white caps because they won't stand out the way they should otherwise. There you go. Now I'm going to switch over to that old square-headed brush. I'm going to grab a little bit of yellow, a little bit of blue, a lot more yellow. I want this to be a much more yellow dominant green. I'm going to take some white, maybe a tiny bit of black. Sorry, you can't see that. Let me redo that for you. I'm going to take some yellow. I'm going to take a little bit of blue. Just a little bit. I'm going to take some titanium white. Maybe a little bit of black. I'm going to work this into the background. I feel like it just needs a little bit more green. And even put some reflections in the water. Now, as we talked about earlier, the top needs to be a lot brighter than the bottom. So I am going to take a little bit of additional Mars Black and work that in down there. Build it up. It'll desaturate it too, which is good because if you remember, we want the background to be much more desaturated. Much better. If you find that you want some additional highlights, not hard to do. Just grab a little bit more of that paint. Don't want a pure white back there. Scrape that off, rework it on. A little more reflection in the water. And we don't have much reflection in the water because it's moving so quickly. If this were a still water, we would have had reflections from all of the colors. So that's also worth noting. While we may love reflections, they may not work in every scenario. Now this area is a little bit sloppy, so I'm going to grab a little bit of black, a little bit more. I'm going to clean that up. Now all of the colors are a little bit more cohesive. I also need to fix this bush. So, black, yellow, see how well that works. Amazingly well. I'm very surprised. It's really nice. We'll get a little bit of a highlight in it. Add a little bit of titanium white. Just do that for the edges. And add a little bit in there. Maybe a little bit in front of this tree. Just build up our layers, right? And there we have it. That is our final hour to 2-ish hour long painting. It's a good thing that we don't hold each other accountable to the time limits in the titles of these things anymore, because we definitely needed some extra time for this. But I hope you didn't mind that it was a little bit longer. I thought that it would be good to take the extra time, really dive into what we need to, and ensure that we were doing things right. I really loved working with this color palette, this color scheme, because I really love the fall. I love how it's kind of cool, so everything else is kind of warm, and we don't get this time of season these colors for very long. So it's nice to cherish them and spend the time with them while we can. With that being said, I can't wait to see what you do with your pieces. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'd be more than happy to help. As always, I'd like to say a big thank you for supporting me and this channel over here on Patreon. You really do make all of this happen, and my life is so much better because of it and because of your patronage. So thank you kindly. I will see you very soon with new lessons, and as always, stay creative.